Can the Korg Trinity rack run Doom? This is undoubtedly a question that's been on everybody's mind, and I'm here to provide an answer. Now, to be clear, I'm not running the actual game on a MIDI sound card. That would be impressive, but I think impossible. I'm talking about translating the MIDI to this cool vintage 90s rompler. The Korg Trinity was a smash hit keyboard when it was released in 1995, and in 1998 we got a rack unit with a few more options, a lot less of a touchscreen, and no keyboard. Let's start with a little bit of terminology. MIDI, or the Musical Instrument Digital Interface, is a communications protocol originally developed in 1981. It allows synthesizers to talk to each other, to talk to another keyboard, for a computer to talk to a synthesizer, and it's still in use today. I use MIDI all the time, whether it's recording digital piano, or electronic drums, or playing back any number of software instruments. Another common term is General MIDI, or GM, and that's often used with retro game soundtracks like Doom. It is a standardized set of instruments so that a soundtrack recorded on one unit can play back properly on another unit. However, MIDI is not a sound, so every synthesizer with General MIDI compatibility will have its own sound, and that's part of the charm and appeal for many people. Now, you may be wondering why I am doing this and why I'm making a video about it, and that's a fair question. The second question is easy to answer. It's because it's cool and I think you'll enjoy it. And I did it and no one else did, so here I am documenting it. As for why I'm doing this, well, it's a good way to learn, and what better way to learn than working on some great classic Bobby Prince songs from Doom. Up until a few days ago, I didn't even think this was possible. Because this unit isn't a general MIDI unit, I didn't know that it supported multitimbral playback, and it does. Many of these old units do, in fact. I also have the Yamaha TG33 here, and while it's not as good for this project as the Trinity rack, it does support playback, and I will show you how Doom sounds on the TG33. Because it's not GM compatible, this is not a plug-and-play sort of deal. I have to go in and select each voice appropriately in the unit for each channel and then route the different channels accordingly in REAPER. And we're going to be looking at how to do that, and it's not terribly difficult, though it's not terribly easy either. Thankfully, I've figured out a number of pretty quick workarounds to simplify this process and perhaps help you if you're in a similar situation or have some old synths lying around that aren't getting much use and you might like to do something fun with them. I did spend a lot of time researching this, digging through old forums and searching in vain for answers that weren't really on the internet. The manual, of course, has a ton of information and it's very long, but it's not always easy to read, and a lot of the commands are pretty difficult with this interface. The original Trinity had a touchscreen that made a lot of these commands easier. There are software editors out there, but the free Trinitro program I tried wouldn't communicate. Maybe it's my interface. Maybe it's just old software that doesn't really work on a modern machine very well. Either way, I've had to sort of learn some ways to program around that. The main hurdle here is patch selection, so I recommend having a copy of the MIDI instrument map as well as whatever your synth is printed out so that you can look through the patches and program that in. It's easy enough to do in REAPER or any modern DAW with a program change message, so long as you send the right information to your synth of choice. Many synths of this era are romplers, which are like samplers, but the samples are pre-baked into the ROM. So they are stored on the machine, there's no way to record new samples. It's probably because I grew up in the 90s, but romplers and general MIDI have a special place in my heart. Many of the classic game soundtracks of the 90s were done using MIDI. And the reason for that is pretty simple. A MIDI file only takes up kilobytes of space. They are incredibly tiny because all they are essentially code. All the processing is then done on your own hardware, whether that's on a game console or with a MIDI card or a computer sound card. It wasn't until the games market switched over to CD that we actually see CD audio, pre-recorded audio, which can of course be anything, either a live band or done using synthesizers. One of my favorite soundtracks, the original StarCraft, was done using a Roland JV-1080. This was a synthesizer geared towards professional musicians and not the home or video game market. The JV-1080 was also used to great effect by Children of Bodom on their early records, and the Korg Trinity was used by all sorts of people like Dream Theater, Depeche Mode, Duran Duran, Rick Wakeman of Yes, Vangelis, Alphaville, and Max Martin, who has basically written every famous pop song for the last couple of decades. Look him up. You don't hear him because he's just in the credits. Someone else gets the glory, but he's the guy writing all the music on the radio, so it's quite the conspiracy. While the Korg Trinity is a true rompler, the Yamaha TG33 is a hybrid FM synthesis and rompler, and it's capable of some really cool things, and hopefully I'll learn how to use it because I only know the basics. I haven't really gotten into patch editing, but that's for another day. I'm by no means an expert on these units, and I've learned a lot in the last week or two, but I'm still just really getting started because this kind of hardware is a little bit dated at this point. But if you do still use these units, or you happen to know a lot about them, I'd really like to hear from you, and you can let me know stuff in the comments or come on over to my Discord and chat about it, because there's a lot to know, and it's really sometimes hard to find good information online or answer specific questions. So I have a few of my favorite songs here from Doom for your listening pleasure, and I even have one rendition of E1M1 on the TG33 just to see how that compares. I've picked a few songs that I think show off the range of this soundtrack and how the Trinity rack handles that. I should also note that all of the tracks are playing simultaneously through the synth. One pass, it's not recorded in parts or stages, so any mixing I have to do by editing the MIDI file before recording it, rather than being able to, change the level of the guitars in Reaper. The recording I will get from Reaper will be all the instruments at once, and I really can't change anything, so there's no post-processing here besides just a little bit of limiting for YouTube. Now, the Doom soundtrack was composed on the Roland SC-55, so that remains the gold standard for the authentic sound of Doom, and I'll put a link in the description to where you can hear that. But I think this unit does a really good job. In some ways, it's better. I think the sounds are often of a higher quality and more realistic, though it maybe doesn't have quite the same charm of the original. Now I'm going to show you how I did this in Reaper, but it really doesn't matter too much what DAW you're using or what synth you're using. The process should be pretty much identical across all systems. As I mentioned, the Korg Trinity and the Trinity rack are not GM compliant, so you have to figure out which voices you want to use and assign them yourself. In my case, I saved them to the Trinity rack, but I recommend just doing it with program changes inside Reaper because you can even change all those voices in the middle of a song, and I will play you a demonstration just to show you the power of that. So I've just dragged a MIDI file into Reaper, and it will come up with this dialog. You want to make sure these top two boxes are checked. We want to expand the MIDI tracks to new Reaper tracks, that's important, and we want to import the MIDI tempo map if it has one. If it doesn't, it's not a big deal. It'll still play at the right tempo. Double-clicking a MIDI item will open up the piano roll by default. And this is where we can see our notes, how long they are, what velocity they are, and also importantly, if we click on this where it says velocity here, that should be the default option, we can see all of the CC channels. And so here we can see that there is also volume information noted by this black dot next to it. And so we can see this is all the volume programming that's going on this track. We can also see that there is a program change message. But we're going to edit that by going over to the events list. This is the third tab in the top left. It will say event list, and that will show us all of the MIDI events. This is the raw data that's being sent over to your MIDI card. And here we have up top, usually something that looks like this. This is a PC message, not a control change. So PC is program change. If we double click on it, we'll see we have bank program select. That is the type of message, and this will work just fine for this unit. Now, the numbers are going to be different, and I have here some printouts of all the voices for my Trinity rack here, and there is quite a lot. This is a couple hundred voices. And I also have another handy printout here of the general MIDI map. So we can see that this instrument is supposed to be 48 here. I've noticed, at least in Reaper, that this number is off by 1, and setting it to 0 will by default be the general MIDI drum kit. So 48 is not actually going to be timpani, as number 48 should be, but it should be 49, which is strings. So I know this is, without even listening to it, a strings patch. Now, there's a lot of strings patches I could choose from here, but I'm just going to go with something easy here. A7 on the Trinity rack is stereo strings, that's the patch, and so I can just type in 7, and I can hit send now, or I can just let the MIDI file play, and it will automatically communicate that change to the card. So the MIDI unit will pick that up. It can happen in the middle of a song. It can happen typically at the beginning of a song, and you're really free to use these program change messages. They will occur as a part of the timeline of the song, so where it happens will immediately trigger that event. To demonstrate this principle, I've written out a little demo here using the Trinity rack, and I've got a program switch, a patch switch right in the middle, and I have found when I was writing this that my patch switching method was perfect. It worked fine. However, inserting a small MIDI event that's not connected to the next part and having that contain the program change message did not register properly. So if it's not working, you can just glue the items together and then it should work properly. I don't exactly know why. It shouldn't matter, but it does, I guess. So I have this all glued together. I have a patch switch in the middle, and I'll just play this, and you'll see. There's 4 patches here, and then 4 different patches on the other side. So if I want to set this to the stereo strings patch, I've got program number 7, and my LSB here is set to 0. Now, I had to figure this out, a little bit of trial and error. It will possibly be different on other units, but I found that 0 is bank A, and this unit is arranged in 4 banks, B, C, and D. So 0 is bank A, 1, if I type this in, this would now be B7, which is the world strings patch. I could change that to number 2, and C7 is sharp brass. This entirely depends on your unit, and you're going to have to do a little bit of cross-referencing to figure it out. So that's the easy way to figure out what it's supposed to be and how to change it. Now, if I wanted to change the voice in the middle of the song, I can go to Insert Bank Program Select Event, and again, just use this. Say I want bank B and patch 2, insert that. It creates 2 items here. And I don't think in Reaper that I actually need this bank select message, at least for this synth. Your mileage may vary. It doesn't hurt anything, I don't think, but you might delete that and just be left with this one that says 121.02. If we go back to our piano roll and say this is a song we wrote and we want to change the velocity, we can just edit this as normal, and that will be sent over to your MIDI device. And you also have all of these different stock effects changes. Now, some of these may not work on every unit, or they may be mapped to something different, but the typical ones should work for almost any unit. That is CC7 as volume, CC10 as pan. Those both definitely work the same way on this particular MIDI unit. And we've got a whole bunch of options here. And you can program these with a MIDI controller. I have an expression pedal. I can record the MIDI data with my expression pedal, and then I can always edit it later. So it's really pretty easy to make those kind of changes and to set up a rich and well thought out MIDI track. And of course, this applies to virtual instruments. This stuff is still important if you're using a modern virtual instrument. That's how you can go in and edit parameters, and depending on the plugin you're using and what controls they are, you might find out what CC it's bound to, and or just MIDI learn that in the VST. Use something like an expression pedal or a fader, a knob, whatever you have. You can usually map out if there's any faders or potentiometers on your keyboard. They may by default be mapped to some of these various CCs. They will be. You can find out what they are and use them that way, or you can remap them. So that's how you can send the correct data to your MIDI unit to make doom music. If you have any ideas for interesting things to do with these synths or things you'd like to hear, then let me know that too. And as always, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.